Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me today is one of the lieutenants from the new Antioch faction for Trench Crusade, and it has gotten its teeth into be pretty deep. It's got such a cool visual language. The game itself, I'm going to make sure that there are links in the description if you want to go check out more. Now this fella, he is a 3D print from their recent Kickstarter, but they are also going to be doing physical examples of this that you can get your hands on. Keep an eye on their website for more. Now most of this fella is actually painted using paints from the upcoming John Blanche Masterclass set from the Army Painter, not for any particular reason beyond I wanted to have a play with them, and I thought, yeah, it'd be interesting to see how can I go for grimdark without really just leaning on slathering it in ochre. So this is, it's a bit of an experiment. I tend not to experiment on camera. Well, I ask you to tell me not to, but all the same. Now the basing for this one will be linked to another video, so it is in the description there, hopefully queued up to the right spot. This one's a little bit longer than usual, so I am going to be quite brutal with some of the editing. Nothing in here is terribly difficult, but there's a few bits that I want to explain when we come to them. So all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Same as always, let's get into it. So once your miniature is all cleaned up and assembled, first thing to do, of course, is to prime him. Now here I've used matte black from the Army Painter as a quick spray, but it honestly does not matter one jot what black you use here. Ordinarily I can get quite picky about my primers. In this instance, black is black is black. It's not going to matter. Now the first thing we're actually going to do is to mix up what is kind of a shadow wash. So what I have here, first of all, this is Banshee Brown. Now this one is from the upcoming John Blanche range from the Army Painter. It's a nice deep dark brown. I'm going to add just a couple of drops of that, maybe a third. It's quite similar to Rhinox Hide if you want to use something like that. Then instead of thinning it out with water, I'm going to use the Warpaints Stabilizer. Now to quickly touch on this, if you've ever been cooking something, you're making a sauce with like a lot of butter in it, and it's emulsifying, it's all going well, then you reach the point where you whisk it just a little too much and it splits and separates. That's kind of what happens when you flood a paint with water. An acrylic paint relies on certain chemicals, certain binders in its medium to keep the pigment doing what you want it to do. Water will eventually shred that and you just get pigment floating around doing its thing. Now if you've ever seen me make up a dust or a rust wash doing that, water is fine for that, works pretty well. For this, what I want is the paint to retain some of its qualities and for that pigment to stay bound in the mix. So instead of water, I'm going to add in 4, 5, and 6. So 2 parts of stabilizer to 1 part of the paint. We'll mix that up and you get an almost wash-like consistency to the paint here. Now once I'm satisfied with that being mixed, what we'll do is apply it fairly liberally all over our miniature. Now this, it will look dreadful going on. Full disclosure, you're probably going to think I've ruined everything here, and I wouldn't blame you. Just take your time, making sure that it does get into everything, and any big bubbles, just pop them with your brush, or work them away. You can blow on the miniature too if you need to. Now once this is dried, it isn't going to look quite as brown. You're going to get a little bit more of the black primer showing through. This is quite handy. This is an old trick from painting Lord of the Rings miniatures, actually, where it gives us shading in the recesses where if we miss anything with our paint, we have a nice, natural, grimy brown rather than really stark black. As well, it's super handy for some of the colors that we're going to paint over the top. So away we go. Let's give this plenty of time to dry once I'm finished. And once that dries, it doesn't make a world of difference. He almost looks rusty, and that's going to be perfect for the sort of finish that I want overall. By the time we're done painting and shading and all that sort of stuff, very little of this is still going to be visible, but it does make these stages a lot easier. So now we're going to move on to areas where we are most likely to make a mess, which is going to be starting from the bottom, like his uniform, and here his skin. So I have Topaz skin, and this will not take terribly long at all. I'm just going to dot in his face with it. Straight over the mustache, and if I hit his mail, I'm not concerned. Now, moving up to his uniform, what I'm going to use is English uniform from Vallejo. Reason being, most of the artwork I've seen of this fella, and most people's interpretations, they tend towards being really green. But, I don't know, the kite shield on his back kind of implies to me British. So I'm going to use English uniform and lean into that a little bit. So over this, you'll see it won't cover perfectly, but that's not a huge problem. I might have a little bit too much water in there. Once this layer has dried, I'd need to apply a second anyhow, so we'll see what we get once that has done. And for the sake of making the leg wraps a little easier to paint, what I'd suggest is go over them with a coat of this now, because it will lighten them up as a base coat for whatever you pop over the top. 2 coats later, nice easy uniform color. Now the next place that I'm thinking of we're likely to make a mess is going to be the wood on the back of his shield, because obviously we're going to have to reach behind him for this. So I'll flip him around, and what I've got here on my brush is Paratrooper Tan. It's nice and light, and it will work very well as a wood color for our shield. Now we're getting somewhere. I have here heavy metal, again one of the John Blanche colors, and I'm going to use this to base coat his cuirass, I guess it is. Now you can use any sort of gunmetal color you want here. You could even paint this as like a painted metal thing, like it was green or some such, but it's up to you. I really like this deep, sinister metal. Now, always moving up, we're going to go to his jacket. Now I've got way too much paint on my brush there. This is Tainted Forest. And again, this is one of the John Blanche ones. I've put maybe a little bit too much water in there. But again, we're going to go over all of these areas twice anyhow. I'm going to use a size 2 brush for most of this. And then when I get closer to areas that I want to be a little bit more careful, I will slow down, stop, and swap to that smaller regiment brush again. Now there goes a fancier looking man. From this point on, it's not going to matter too much what order you start doing things in. So what I'm going to turn to first is khaki. And with this, I'm going to go over his leg wraps. We're now going to go back to Banshee brown, but this time we're going to use it essentially neat. There's just a little bit of water in there as you normally would for an acrylic paint, but we're going to tidy up the leather straps that are visible. As well, now there are a couple of sections here, like on the artwork, this bit of his glove doesn't look like glove, it looks like the underside of his jacket, but I'm going to paint it like it is a leather part of a bigger gauntlet. I really wanted a dark grey in the Fanatic range, and lo and behold, so did John Blanche. So what I've got here is Ironclad grey. This one is just off black when it dries, and when we shade it, it's going to look fantastic. So I'm going to use this on his boots, and I'm also going to paint the metalwork on his Thompson with this. Now to start off his helmet, I'm going to use here, this is Wyvern Fury. It is a nice deep red. It's listed as a cool red by the Army Painter standards, which kind of fits. I'll also pop a little bit of it on his medals here. Now for the other ribbons on his uniform, I've added a little bit of Aegis blue and some warped yellow. I'll pop those in the description too, so you don't miss out on those, but it's just a couple of seconds with a brush there. What I'm going to turn to now is True Copper, and this is going to go over the cross and the patches on his jacket, the little square patches. See, this covers relatively well, but I am going to come back and give it a second coat once this one's dry. Now, having also tapped in some of his medals with a little bit of that True Copper, I have here some Greedy Gold, and I'm going to brighten those up just a little before we come to shading them, because I do want these to be relatively prominent on his chest. Once you're satisfied with how the cross is painted, you can get in with some Midnight Olive. Now this is a dark olive drab, again from the John Blanche set. There are, any number of colors you could use in its place if you wanted to, though. I just like to do it at this stage, because I tend to find it's easier to go around the gold bits that I have painted than it is to paint the green and then try and keep the gold tidy. Now this is where our plate mail metal comes in. Now, you might be tempted to dot in the rivets or the nails that are holding on the cover to the shield. Those would likely have been painted over the top of anyhow, so I'm not going to bother with that work. What I am going to do is brighten up his mail, like I said I was, and I'll also paint in just a couple of other bits that I want to brighten up with some nice bright metallic color. Now with some leather brown, I'm going to paint in any wooden bits that are visible on his weapon. Obviously, if he were carrying a rifle, this would take slightly longer. The very last detail that I haven't touched on yet is going to be the little crosses sewn into his sleeves. Now for these, I'm going to use ivory, but there is no reason that you couldn't use pretty much anything, even a white. Just if you're picking up the John Blanche sets, you'll have this, and I really like it. Now the wash that we're going to use over everything is Grimdark Shadow. Now this has a very faint greenish tint to it. It's like a very dark, almost black green, which will sound insane considering some of the colors we're going to put it over. But same as something with a brownish tint, what's going to happen is it's going to interact with the colors underneath it in a very interesting way, trust me. What I've gone ahead and done is to mix it up with half and half speed paint medium. And when folks ask why the speed paint medium, it's because I want this to flow. The quick shade medium is a little bit more sticky. This I want to move. So over everything, you'll see as I'm applying it, wherever it starts to collect, don't let it settle too heavily. Just guide it where you want it to go. Give it a couple of seconds, and then if you need to move it again, you can do. But you'll see, even that green, it's not immediately visible. What it's going to do is make this jacket seem much more green by comparison. But other colors, it's going to give us this deep, sort of desaturated shadow effect, which is going to look wonderful. So, over the entire miniature, we'll give them then about half an hour to dry, somewhere nice and warm. Now, big clumps like this at the bottom of the jacket, while it's still wet, using a damp brush, just lightly drag it away until you're happy with what you're leaving behind. All right, don't remove it all, but big clumps like that, that's going to look, yeah, a little bit better. So, now I'm happy to leave them somewhere to dry. And then once that's dried, you'll see what I mean about it turning to almost cool, sinister shadows, like especially up on the red there, how, yeah, that really works in the recesses. Even over the gold, the metallic stuff, it's a touch green, but not so much that it immediately screams it at you from across the room, which is what we're going to do and fix up with a little bit of our base coats again. So for example, on his uniform here, to get rid of some of that green tint, I'm going to go over with a little bit of fresh English uniform, not very much, and just pick out flatter areas where I want that natural color to come back. Leave a little bit of your tinted sinister green stuff in the recesses, but have some fun with this. Now that just takes a couple of seconds on his uniform there. What I'm going to do is do the same thing again with the tainted green for his jacket. This is going to be a little bit more interpretive, let's say. Nice straight lines as you get started with it. Leaving a little bit of shaded bits towards the edges of areas. And in these gaps here, leave those dark as well. Now from the side here is a good spot to see where you get all that extra definition and shading and what have you. It's really cool. It takes a little bit of practice spotting where you want to do that, but with enough trench coats, you're going to have plenty of practice. We'll do the same with the Wyvern Red, and then we'll move on to some highlights. Now for some areas, in a fairly subtle highlight, what you might do is mix in roughly half and half ivory with your base color. So here on his trousers, for example, I've got a little bit of ivory that was left behind on my palette. I'd ordinarily recommend, pop some fresh stuff out, but was able to mix that in with some of the English uniform remaining. All we're going to do is pick out extreme edges and creases, get a nice third dimension going there. And then as you come near the very edges, you can add in a little bit more ivory to get an even sharper crease. That's what we're going to do on the tainted green. I've put some fresh stuff of that onto my palette. And again, roughly half and half, that and ivory, though maybe a little bit more of the tainted green. Maybe you can always add more ivory. So if you mix them up on your palette, you apply it to your miniature and it's a little bit dark, then wait a few seconds, add just a tiny touch more ivory at a time until you get the color that you want for your highlights. Now we're not going to highlight everything by mixing in ivory because obviously with the metallic colors that's not going to work, and sometimes it's just nice to have those pre-mixed colors from the Fanatic range. So I'm moving up to here, this is Jasper skin, and I want just a tiny bit of this on my brush at a time because I am going to very carefully paint in most of his skin again with this and leave just a little of the shaded Topaz skin in the recesses. The one thing that I'm going to try to avoid is his bottom lip, because I tend to find if that's already been shaded and is a darker skin tone, that works fine without having to color it in anyhow. And then finally with some leopard stone skin, this is getting a bit on the, making me a bit nervous. I'm going to do the very tip of his nose, bottom of his chin, and the extreme edges of his cheekbones, which I am going to do, I think, off camera. Yep. And then if, like me, you're a little worried you've overdone it, just a wee bit of warm skin shade into the recesses there, relatively carefully. We'll bring that all back together. And while that dries, we can use a little bit of blood chalice to pick out the very edges of the helmet. Try not to go too deep with this, otherwise it's going to look orange. Now for our leather, we're going to use Dryad Brown as our highlight color. This, again, you want to be fairly sparing with it. Just catch the edges where you can. If you end up with anywhere that your highlights are way too thick, you can go back to your base color and essentially use it like an eraser. Just go over the excess highlight and get rid of it. With a little bit of plate mail metal, what I'm doing is going back to some of the detail on the chest piece. I'm just going to ding that slightly. I don't want single straight lines, I just want little scratches. And I can go over some of the mail as well if I want to highlight that too. I'm also going to do this on the sword, flip them around, and just drag a nice smooth line across that top there. Now for any of the gold or copper or anything like that that you want to highlight, what I've got is true brass. Now this is quite intense, it's almost a silver, so just little touches of this will do the job for your highlights. And once you're satisfied with that, you can spend an age, highlighting pretty much everything on the miniature, the shield, the gun, all that sort of thing. But I like to have a point where I'm going to call it quits. I'm not finished, but for the most part, all my colors are applied. So I'm going to apply a varnish here. Now this is Instar's Varnish Plus, really nice brush on one. And it goes super matte once it's dried. Just don't let it collect too heavily in any recesses. Now once this is dried, I've got one more step that I want to have some fun with. And if you've seen the finished product, you might have a bit of an idea what that's going to be. Now as a quick tip, if you do want your final metallic highlights to stay quite shiny, then what you can do is varnish your chap first, then go ahead and do those light silver and the true brass and what have you. But for me, I like them to be a little bit more muted. All the same, let's come back once this is dried. Now I can't stress enough the value of a good varnish. Really brings everything together, evens out a paint job, just wonderful. What I'm going to do is pop them aside for a second because we're going to mix up our ochre wash. So this time I've got Sunburst Ochre, and I'm going to pop out 1, 2 drops of that. That's all I want. And out comes our stabilizer again. So for 2 drops of the ochre, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's really drench this. So let's try that with 8 drops of stabilizer. So I really want to thin it out. Run it up the side of my palette. See how it runs down quite quickly. That's perfect. That's what I want. Now we're going to use a little bit of that on the end of a brush. So I'll run some of that along the edge of the shield there. Just dab it a couple of times over where that's collected. From the front here, what I'll do is pop a little bit of it under his belt. Some of it onto his uniform. You know, I do want a little of this to kind of color some of the shadows. I don't want to go crazy with it. And I do want to try and get that, that little bit of fluff off my brush. And if I put too much on, I can quickly wiggle it around with my fingertip. So what I am going to do is add just a little bit of that yellowy ochre, I guess, illness to some of the recesses. Particularly areas where the metal stuff joins. Cloth is a good space for this. In some of the deeper recesses, just give that a little bit of color. Anywhere that you reckon it's a bit flat. So this is where, instead of having to start all the way back at a yellow, we can just add a little bit of warmth, kind of targeted into some of our recesses. Don't want to overload your entire miniature with this, but you can have a little bit of fun with it. Just experiment. Smudge it in with your fingertip if you have to. This is now in the realm of experimenting. This, we're now at 10 drops of stabilizer for just 2 drops of paint. And I kind of realized how poorly I had explained this earlier on. The idea here is that we're adding a little bit of warmth, a little bit of the dustiness of the environment, kind of the same as if we were to be doing a dust filter, but instead we're using a specific color. We're using that ochre to add warmth to the color scheme, but without adding warmth to the colors chosen, if that makes sense. So he's a little bit more vibrant, a little more interesting to look at, but he is still predominantly greens and browns. But now that I'm happy with this, what I'm going to do is go ahead and pop his base on him. The recipe for that will be in the description. It'll be nice and simple. And I'll link to the video where I actually demonstrate that too. So don't feel you're going to be completely missing out just because I haven't done it here. So let's get a look at what he looks like when he's all finished. And so, there at last, our new Antioch lieutenant is complete. Although, considering I have painted him wearing an English uniform, he should probably be a lieutenant. But I digress. I had a lot of fun painting him, as I tend to, and it was really interesting to dip into how to get the most out of a fairly limited palette, because most of the Trench Crusade artwork features, you know, a faction has a particular color about it. So whether it be green or, you know, that muted sort of fleshy gray for some of the more evil inclined stuff, it's neat following along quite close to the artwork and seeing what you can get out of that. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, and very importantly, resin in this case, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you very much for your support, folks. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked down there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.